You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you. As always, it's a great Monday morning. We've been able to talk to players and coaches. Fall football is in effect, man. It's a great time to be alive. We get football this month, so let's jump into it. So today we're going to take a look at the preseason coaches poll that was just released, and an update on some recruiting stuff, and a jump into Camp Kyle. So we'll get into that, but first let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. It's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. And while we're on that, this month we're launching our college and pro pick'em at ksl.com. So we're back to doing that. This is the 10th season for college football, and the second season we've been doing the NFL. So if you've participated in the past, go ahead and sign up again. If not, go tell your friends, family, coworkers, whatever. It's just a fun way to be able to get in there and, pick some games, 5 games each week. If the 3 local FBS teams are in, BYU, Utah, and Utah State, they will be part of those picks, and then we'll take 2 national games. And each week you have a chance to win prizes. So the top winner of the week, the person with the highest score, gets a $100 gift card. So it's worth your time. It doesn't take a lot of effort. Just go in there, pick the score, the winning team, and you may come out as a winner. So use that as some bragging rights, have some fun. Go ahead to ksl.com and sign up for that. There'll be details on the homepage here soon. If not, you can just go right to the nav and go to the Pick'em section in the sports. So that's it. We'll do that. So let's jump into what was released earlier this morning. So the USA Today Coaches Poll was released this morning. This is the one, it's the first one that comes out in terms of quote unquote official rankings. I know people don't love preseason rankings, but this is what we get. And the coaches poll is always an interesting one. It's I don't know how to describe it. Like it's one that obviously has some value, but it doesn't at the same time. It's quite honestly, it's the school's PR staff, their SID, their sports information director, who is usually compiling this, and so it may say Kyle Whittingham, but in reality it's somebody on staff. So this is basically a compilation of that, how these teams are viewed. The AP is the media, and then obviously you get the college football playoff one later in the season, which is a selection committee, and that is the official one, and that's where the rankings go. Those college football playoff ones and the AP generally are fairly similar. The coaches poll is sometimes the same, but you get a little bit more wayward stuff in the coaches poll. Not to say it's not a good poll, it's just a little bit different. And I think the preseason one definitely feels that way. I think you're getting some teams in here, and I'll jump into this in a sec, but you're getting some teams in here that are getting some love from last year despite kind of what transpired with their roster in the offseason. So I don't know that, it's preseason, right? Like it is what it is. I think it'll be interesting to see how this compares to the AP poll next week, but it is what it is. So in terms of the top 10, there are no Big 12 teams in the top 10. So it follows as such. Texas is ranked as the number 1 team in the country this year coming into the preseason, followed by national champions Ohio State, then Penn State, Georgia, Notre Dame, Clemson, Oregon, Alabama, LSU, and Miami. So that's your top 10 right there. Hard to argue with really any of that top 10. I would probably rearrange some of those. I did rearrange some of those on my ballot, but you'll get to see that next week. So that's the top 10. And then in terms of the Big 12 teams, so Arizona State checks in at number 11, just outside of that top 10. They're the ones that are carrying the flag for the Big 12 right now as the reigning champs from the conference. That one, it feels like a no-brainer with how many people they have coming back. You could convince me that the team takes a step back this year. and I wouldn't be surprised. But at the same time, they're going to get the love that they are the best team in the conference right now until they're not, right? If you believe some of the early quotes that Kenny Dillingham had after his first few days of spring camp, where he said, some teams have to go 5-7, and if you're satisfied with that, that's what it's going to look like, because they didn't come out as hot as he was hoping for. So, he's using it as a motivation tool. He's putting it in the media to kind of say, hey, you guys have to be better. But I think maybe some of that press may have gone to their heads. We'll see, right? Day one, it's easy to kind of bounce back from that. So we'll be curious to see what happens there. And then the rest of the teams ranked from the Big 12 include 20 Kansas State, 21 they're tied with Texas A&M, is Iowa State. And then at 23 is BYU, Texas Tech at 24. So interesting. Kansas State and Iowa State obviously, are expected to be in there. I think BYU is definitely getting some love from last year. I think based on kind of their roster and kind of who they've lost, I'm a little surprised to see them in the top 25, but it's not a stretch either, right? Clearly they were a great team last year. I think, putting them at 23 is not a bad situation at all. I think it shows some respect from what happened last year, as well as recognizing that they're not quite as good as where they landed last year. So we'll see, right? Like, that could be low, that could be high. We'll see what happens. Texas Tech, obviously, they're the kind of the sleeper team that everybody is expecting to be good, but we're still waiting to see what happens there. So ranking them 24th, I think, is fair, given what they were last year. You could put them higher and you could convince me that they deserve that. You could unrank them and you could convince me of that. I think there's a lot of unknowns with this team, and so it'll be really interesting to see how they're kind of viewed and kind of how they perform on the field. Their schedule early on is pretty easy, so same with BYU. They've got a pretty easy schedule, and so I think both of these teams could absolutely stay in that rankings, assuming that they show out on the field. And then you've got teams receiving votes from the Big 12. There's 5 teams from the conference that are receiving votes. Utah comes in as the highest quote-unquote ranked team in the receiving votes. They would rank 30th. Look, it's not a true ranking in terms of where these teams fall. It essentially just means they got more votes than maybe a team below them. So I'm going to say rankings, but in reality, it's not that case. It just means that they had more votes to be included in the top 25 than maybe some other teams. So Utah checks in at 30th, Baylor at 31. So you have 2 teams that are probably viewed as similar right now. I would argue that Baylor should be in the top 25. You could make a case that they're even above Kansas State in my mind, just with how much they have returning, kind of the trajectory that they were on, especially with kind of who they bring back. I think there's a big case that they can jump any of those teams and be right below Arizona State in terms of the rankings. So, I would say too low there. Then there's TCU that would check in at 38, Colorado at 45, and Kansas 49. I mean, those are teams that got some love, but they're on the fringe. They're at the bottom of that. So that's where the Big 12 checks in. Obviously, that falls pretty well in order with kind of how Vegas views these teams in terms of having a potential spot to win the Big 12. There's not a lot of consensus in terms of who is going to lead. Obviously, the betting lines have changed a little bit, and Utah has actually taken the top line in many of these betting sites, but Arizona State, Texas Tech, Baylor, many of them are also at the top. So it's just kind of some chaos. It's that parity that everybody's been talking about in terms of the Big 12. So we'll see what happens, right? Like, preseason rankings, I understand, are meaningless. They don't mean a ton, but at the same time, they have their value in terms of kind of the trajectory that our voters are expecting. So, like I said, coaches poll is just kind of the first nod. And then next week we get the AP poll, which is considered the official poll for the bulk of the season until the college football playoff rankings are released. So, we'll get those soon. So next week, just as kind of your information for those that care about this stuff, my poll, which I've been doing this for the last few years, I can't even remember how many years now at this point, but my poll will drop on Sunday morning, so you'll be able to see how I rank teams. You can pull it apart, pick it apart, do whatever you want. It's not perfection by any means, but there's none that are perfection at this point in the season. So They all kind of weigh out at the end, and you kind of gravitate to the teams that are the best. So it is what it is. And then the official preseason AP Top 25 poll is released on Monday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. So you'll get your first preseason look there of the quote-unquote official poll, and we'll hit the ground running. I think it'll be fun to kind of see where these teams are, and we're getting close. Just a few more weeks until week 0. I know nobody really considers that as the official start of college football, even though we'll all watch it. We'll all have a good time with Iowa State and Kansas State in Ireland, and it'll be fun. We want to see that. But then the official weekend, the weekend of August 30th, that's when everything starts. Utah's at UCLA, the Rose Bowl, and so we'll have some fun there. Looking a little bit now at the recruiting, Utah took a hit this last week, and they took a hit in the sense that number one target from the state of Utah and Celeste Moa, 5-star consensus athlete, decided to commit to Tennessee. I've said for a long time that it's been down to Utah and Tennessee. These two teams have been going back and forth. The early consensus and Steve Wiltfong of On3, put in his prediction that it was going to be Utah a few weeks ago. By all accounts, but everybody that I've talked to and kind of the things that I've read, this was a reality, right? Like everything was trending toward Utah. Everything was going towards that. And then, a night before, Moa essentially made his decision known and let Tennessee know, let Utah know. So, I think this is one, based on everything that I've read with him. I haven't had a chance to talk to him personally on this, but everything that I've read is that Tennessee, the allure of playing in the SEC, really kind of outweighed anything else with Utah. Utah was ready and willing to match anything. Obviously, they want to be able to get the top kid in the state of Utah, but at the end of the day, playing in the SEC kind of won out. Now, look, these two teams could be completely different in a few weeks, few months, and that may sway a situation. I doubt it. I think Moa is committed to Tennessee, but I think there's always a chance until a guy signs, right? So Utah is going to stay in the mix here. This is a guy that they absolutely want and will continue to have them, but at the same time, it is a loss to the Utes. So I know, it's real easy to kind of throw your hands up and say Utah's screwed, or that, this is the beginning of the end type situation, which is all hyperbolic. The reality is this is one player, right? Now, don't get me wrong. It's a high-level player, 5-star talent. You need these guys, right? You need the top guys from your state. You need talented players to be able to improve your roster. But in this age of recruiting, I don't know that it's as much of an impact as maybe it was years ago, right? You still want to be high. You still want to be able to have a team that ranks high in the recruiting rankings, whether that's from a marketing advantage or whether that's just from being able to bring in top-tier talent. You need to bring that, right? So the higher in the rankings, the better chances you have, at least historically, of being able to compete for a national championship. At the end of the day, there's still the transfer portal. The transfer portal is a big aspect of college football. You look at where Utah went this offseason. Yes, they had a large class, but I would say a majority of those kids aren't going to contribute at least on day one or maybe at all this season, right? There's definitely some kids that Utah brought in that have that potential, and we'll talk about some of them in a second. But at the same time, you're looking more to guys that have been a little bit more proven, whether that be down at a lower level, at FCS or a group of 5, or, making a lateral shift through some other P4 team. Those are the players that they're bringing in. So I think you put a little bit more stock into those types of players and being able to have that. Whereas if you can get guys that, feed into your system, that buy into your recruiting plan and, your culture, whatever culture is, then it works for these recruits. But you could take the Deion Sanders approach and say, look, I'm just basically training guys for another team. And unless they're going to compete on day one, and there's no reason Celeste Moa wouldn't have competed on day one, but these other players, there's a chance that you're just basically developing them for another team. And that's fine, right? Like, that's the nature of college football. It's the nature of where we're at. But I think this is where kind of Utah has to balance it out. Obviously, you want those top tier recruits. You got to get those guys in, but I don't think it's as drastic of a loss as it used to be in the sense that you can now go to the portal. And Utah clearly went to the portal. They've hit really well at the portal, far better than, I wouldn't even say far better, but they've hit at a higher level than maybe what the recruiting can be. You need a balance, but at the same time, I think you're finding some success there. So one of the guys that they have committed to the 2026 class was a community college transfer JUCO guy, Josiah Jefferson, tight end, top tight end from the JUCO ranks, was expected to come in 2026, but he actually got a waiver approved by the NCAA to be able to come in immediately and come in for 2025. So this is another tight end body that you're able to get on the roster this season, but I wouldn't plan on him getting significant time yet. I would, at the very least, consider it a redshirt season. He's got a redshirt season, so he's still got, a few years. I think it's 3 more years that he could play with a 4th season involved, so 4 to play 3. So you've got a redshirt season. Get him in the system, get him understanding kind of what's going on here, and then next year you can be that impact player quicker than what it would have been, next year with him coming in the 26th class. So we'll see. There's still a chance that he can have an impact on this season, but I think Utah is pretty well stacked at tight end right now, especially kind of how they're using them with Hunter Andrews, him as kind of the H-back Swiss Army knife guy, JJ Buchanan, a freshman coming in who's had a great fall already. He's impacted in there. You've got Dallin Bentley, you've got Otto Tia, you've got a lot of guys that are in there already that are, quote unquote proven, whatever that means at this point, seeing that you still have to see it on the field. But to see Josiah Jefferson get in there early would be, it would be a long shot, especially since I don't think he's going to be here immediately. It's going to take a little bit, but he'll be here for the season, and we'll see if he gets any playing time as the season develops. But we'll talk to Kyle and everything about that and this week, kind of see his take on it, kind of what happened there. But Utah gets another player to its roster, another proven guy at a lower level who has some upside, but it's going to take some acclimation, especially with those JUCO kids who Kyle has talked about. They don't always have the best training habits at a JUCO ranks because it's just a different level. And so there may be some rust. There may be some things that they have to break out habit-wise. But by all accounts, this is a talented kid that should be an impact player for Utah, maybe this year, but most likely next. All right, let's jump into Camp Kyle. We're a few days past this now. If you're really diehard and you've been following along on Twitter or other reports from myself or other people, you maybe have heard some of these things. But I hope to provide some context to it, knowing that the first week of fall camp, I don't want to say it's meaningless, but there's just not a lot of context, right? Guys are just barely reporting. This is their first official look at players. And though they get some reports from, their off-season workouts, like, their weight training or their off-season workouts, for the most part, this is the first real look that you get of your team. And so this last week was a good proving ground for what will set up to be this week. This week we'll get a little bit more insight into where Utah is at. Obviously, you've got a few more weeks before the season starts, before they get into game week, and you've got to be ready. I feel like just by the vibes and the conversations that we've had, the energy around this team remains high. I've talked about this since spring, where the vibes around this team are just different, and it's hard to quantify what that means or if it will mean anything, but the vibes are high, right? You've got a team that is pulling in the same direction. There's not a lot of factions trying to cause problems. Not that there are many years, but I think you may have some ulterior motives from some guys who are trying to, get to a different team or whatever that may be. You've got a lot of guys here that are fully embracing the moment, fully embracing that Utah needs to be a better team and that they can kind of be at a level that is going to be competitive in the Big 12. So, I think that bodes well. You kind of contrast that with what I was saying with Kenny Dillingham in Arizona State. They came into the offseason, or from the offseason into this first few camp, and he hated it, right? And I know there's a lot of pressure on Arizona State right now. You have to live up to those expectations. Everybody's still thinking you're this top team, and that's that pressure that Utah has felt, the last few years, where you're expected to be this top team, and if you're not handling your business the right way, maybe you come into camp in a bad way, and maybe you don't handle it the right way. And look, I don't follow Arizona State, so I don't know the full nuances or details to that. I just see a quote from Dillingham, watched him kind of watch his frustration, and you could see it in his face. He's a very candid guy, and you can see the frustration there. Contrast that with Utah, where Kyle Whittingham was very complimentary, especially of his offense. And I don't want to say you rarely get that. Over the last few years, like when Cam Rising was leading the team, you got that a little bit more. This year, I feel like, I don't want to call him a relaxed Kyle Whittingham because he's dialed in, right? But I think you're getting a guy that was very pleased with how the offense came into the offseason and then transitioned into fall camp. He said there was compared to spring, they're much more efficient in their operation, and they're just cleaner overall, right? Like there's a lot less procedural penalties. There's a lot less struggles to get to the line and getting the right guys in there. It seems like the team has really embraced kind of that work ethic in the offseason to be able to transition to now. And that has absolutely led to the offense being the star of the team this first week. Those are good things, right? Like, I know some people will look at that and say, oh, the defense is crap and they're not, able to do what they need to. I think this just shows how versatile and talented this offense can be based on kind of how they've hit the ground running. There's going to be mistakes, right? Like there's going to be some things in these next few days, weeks that the offense is going to take a step back. They're not always going to be crisp, especially as fall camp develops, because it's just a grind, right? And Utah, more than any team, I don't want to say more than any team, but more than most teams, push these guys. And I'll get to that point in a second when we talk about Morgan Scalley and kind of how they approach this. But this is a team that right now is hitting the ground running. There's still steps that have to be made to be able to get to where Utah needs to be to feel like that they compete at a high level in the Big 12, right? This is just day 1, day 2, day 3 type situations. But the fact that they're already hitting the ground running the way that they are, with the aggression, the physicality, the energy, the cleanliness that they have, bodes well. Now, starting this week, you're going to get into pads, right? You're going to get guys that are going to hit more. The defense has a little bit more of a leg up because now that they can start actually being more aggressive, things are going to change, right? It's easy when you just have your shells on or just your jersey on for the defense to not be able to go full tilt because you can't tackle, you can't do things like that. And so there's some advantages in that first little bit for the offense. But the fact that you have the offense hitting early is a good thing, right? Kyle said it's very clear that they work together a lot in the offseason, and it's showing up on the field in fall camp. So those types of that type of progress has to continue through these next weeks. But as it stands, everything sounds good for this offense. Sounds good for this team. Once again, it all has to show itself on the field come August 30th and moving forward. But you at least have a team that sounds good. Now, if you'll remember, there was a situation it's not a situation, but it was kind of I don't want to call it a similar vibe, but there was a lot of talk about the team doing well last year going into fall camp with Cam Rising, right? And it was. It's not to say that this team wasn't doing well. There was just a different vibe. It wasn't a bad vibe. It was a bad vibe later on in the season, but it wasn't a bad vibe in the sense of the team not approaching it the right way. There was just a little bit more, I wouldn't call it arrogance, but I would call it a little bit more confidence in knowing that, like, oh, we've got Cam Rising, we're going to rest on him. Everything's going to be great because he's going to go out there and do well. And, that first game and a half, they were, right? Like, Utah against Baylor just absolutely cooked. And so it can have a tendency to kind of foretell what can happen, but at the same time, it's not a full indication of what can be, right? I do think this year, and I've said this multiple times, Utah's better established than they were last year to be able to take those hits, right? Like if Devin Dampier were to go down, I know somebody's knocking wood right now. If Devin Dampier were to go down, Utah, I feel like, can absorb it a little bit better. I don't know that it's going to be much better than what it was last year, but I feel like they've brought in much more complementary players to be able to help this. Obviously, we've talked about the changes on the offensive staff and what that can do, but this is a team that I think they've got the right vibes and the right mindsets to be able to approach it in a way where if a guy goes down, it's not going to be backbreaking. I think last year was very detrimental in the sense that Cam was still questionable every single week until they finally ruled him out. And then at the same time, it was just another one of those things where, great, now we've lost our guy again. What do we do, right? And so it's just playing that head game with the team. Utah's not there now. Cam Rising is not on the field. There's no questions about who the starting quarterback's going to be. It's now a much more loose / confident / underdog mentality where everybody is doubting you. You've got that bad taste in your mouth from the year before, and everybody is kind of pulling in the same direction to be able to move forward. There's a reason why teams like Arizona State and BYU were able to be successful last year, because they had that same mindset. You obviously had to back it up on the field, and just because you're all pulling in the same direction and you play the everybody's doubting us card, that's the intro, right? You've got to be able to continue to move forward with that and continue to have that same edge to you every single week. Let's say Utah comes out and they go 4-0, 6-0, whatever it may be. You've got to be able to still have that edge. If not, you play, I don't want to say, you just play with a different type of mindset. And so you have to keep that edge. You have to keep feeling like you're being overlooked, and you've got to keep moving forward with that. So I've spent too long on that point, but let's just suffice it to say that the offense has hit the ground running, and they're doing well. Kyle Whittingham has praised this offensive line up and down. He feels like with them, they can do anything. Wayshawn Parker last week, I don't know if he quite guaranteed it as was reported, but he definitely has a goal of 1,500 yards. He wants to cross that 1,000-yard mark. Devontae Booker is kind of the guy that he looks to as a guy that came from a similar area. And so he's looking at kind of being that guy, right? He wants to be the Devontae Booker of this offense. And if you can get anywhere near a Devontae Booker in this Utah offense with Wayshawn Parker, and then have the complementary guys around him, including Devin Dampier, who runs the ball. You've got Nate Johnson. You've got a whole bunch of other guys. That bodes incredibly well for Utah. So Kyle talked about, he didn't shy away from downplaying Wayshawn's dreams or goals. If anything, he said, if the offensive line is what we think it is, that shouldn't be a problem to be able to get 1,000 yards. So you're getting a different kind of vibe from Kyle this year, where he's got this quiet confidence about him, where he knows that his team can be really good. And we'll see what happens with that. At the same time, these offensive linemen, Caleb Lomu talked to us this last week about how all those preseason accolades, all that stuff means nothing. They have to back it up on the field. And I think they're approaching it with the right mindset, where they understand that there's a lot, not even a lot of pressure, but a lot of eyes on, Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu specifically, but the offensive line in general, and they are using that as opportunities to showcase who they can be. Once again, we'll see that on the field. Let's transition to a little bit of the audio from these guys. Kyle Whittingham's audio that I had, it was a scorching day that day, and my phone blew up, and it died. So that was part one that I had a problem, and then some other audio that I got just wasn't as great. I need to do a better job of that for this. Usually it's not a problem, but this first week was terrible. So I don't have audio from Kyle Whittingham that is playable on here. So I'm going to use some audio from Jason Beck and Morgan Scalley primarily. We've got other coaches that talked to us last week, but I'm going to stick with that in the sake of time. So let's start with the offense. The offense itself, as I said, has been, operating at a high level. They really like what Jason Beck has done. Kyle Whittingham has talked about, this is his offense. And I think based on where Utah is at, he has to kind of lean in on it, right? Like he can't just go away from what Jason Beck does. And so I think you're going to see a fairly high level of embracing of Jason Beck's offense. And right now, in the early days, it has paid off, right? that'll change in the games. I think there's going to be some things where some things change, but I really think Utah and specifically Kyle Whittingham wants to see an effective offense, and so we'll see what happens. But I think there is a true desire to see what Jason Beck can do, and they're embracing it fully. So let's start with some audio of Jason Beck. This is him talking about kind of what his approach is as he comes into fall camp and kind of what he's looking for in the early days.
Spring ball is about installing the offense. What is the next phase in fall camp in terms of your offense and getting it integrated with the guys?
You obviously need to be ready for all the situations that are going to be coming up. And it's really identifying who are the trustworthy guys, the playmaker guys. When you put those 11 guys together, all doing their different roles, who can you depend on and count on? So it's a matter of finding consistency, who's showing up every day, consistently getting their job done. So we know we can count on them to put them out there for the game. So that's what you're trying to develop that and tease that out of who to count on when you put them out there.
Not groundbreaking by any means, but at the same time, I think that's how he's approaching it, right? He's talked about that from day one in his press conference. He's trying to find the guys that they can rely on, right? And that may not be a guy that others have penciled in, right? I think the majority of those guys have been that case. I think they've approached the offseason with the right mindset, but he's going to find the guys that are consistent. And if it means it's a freshman, he'll put him in. If it means it's a veteran, he'll put him in. There's no, I don't want to say that there's not some set hierarchy in terms of kind of how these players are. Like Dallin Bentley, for example, is one of the most veteran guys on the offense just from his time being in there. But if there's guys that are better than Dallin Bentley, they're not going to say, well, he's been in the system. They're going to play the more consistent, the more effective guy. And I'm not saying that Bentley hasn't been that guy, but using him as an example because he's about the only one left outside of the offensive line that has had a longer tenure on that offensive side of the ball. But I think that's how they're going to approach it. It's really going to come down to the guys that are effective. And look, this isn't, like I said, earth-shattering, groundbreaking news. I mean, this is what offensive coordinators are supposed to do. But I think you're looking at that with much more fresh eyes this year than you have in years past, where you could pencil in Cam Rising, you could pencil in Brant Keithy, you could pencil in some of these guys, and not that they weren't effective, but I think you've got a lot of guys on this roster who are new to this team, a lot of guys that, you could say, oh, they followed Jason Beck from New Mexico and just pencil him in for knowing it, let's say like a Ryan Davis or an Akari Rogers. Like that's not going to be a guarantee, right? And so it's guys that are going to come in and approach this year probably in a different way than any year in the last few years where there's just a lot of openness, right? Devin Dampier is obviously your guy, but he's backing it up and he's doing the things that needs to be done to be able to get there. It's all of that. So I don't want to belabor this point because I don't think it's that big, but at the same time, I think it's a good philosophy to have of being able to find the guys that are consistent and moving forward. So let's shift now to kind of his conversation about what he's trying to do with the offense, his philosophy, and kind of how they're going to operate this year.
Kyle talked about this offense will be pretty similar to what you ran at New Mexico. How similar to that, and kind of what are you trying to do that's maybe different, or are you trying to do anything different?
We're still in that process of that playing out. For instance, when we started at New Mexico last year, we had 5-6 skilled receivers that we thought were going to be some of our better players. And as we headed in that first game, that was kind of the trajectory we were on. Well, as we got early in the season, some of those guys were struggling to consistently make plays, and our running backs were way rising up in what they were doing. And so that thing shifted, in that course, and there became 2 receivers and a tight end that we really relied on, and then it was all these running back guys. And so the offense kind of molded more that direction. So, with the Devin and the O-line, that's the most predictable right now. It's the other spots that are more what direction is this going to take with the dependable playmaker, guys you trust, and kind of the offense molding, shifting that direction.
For fans that haven't seen it yet, how would you kind of describe your offensive philosophy?
man, we really just want to put the right guys in the right places to make plays. We want to adapt to what our strengths are and play to those strengths. Real like eye test. We're gonna go not at a fast tempo, but we're going no huddle. We're moving guys around. Kind of spread. The QB reads and RPOs are in there, but year to year, that thing always shifts to who's your personnel and what are their strengths. And some years that's more passing, some years that's more running. So that thing will vary because we want to play to our strengths.
There's a lot of interesting side notes as part of this, right? Like you look at what he did at New Mexico, had the fourth best offense in the country. You had Dampier who did what he did. And it really felt like, he talked about the injuries and everything and kind of that offensive philosophy shifting a bit based on their personnel. It really felt like you had Devin Dampier. The best way that I can explain this is kind of like when you have like a D1 type talent at a high school level, and it's clear and obvious to everybody on the field that he's the best player. And everybody else on the team, it's not that they're not good, but they're just clearly at a different level. That's kind of what it feels like Devin Dampier was last year for New Mexico. There came a point where obviously their run game was much more effective based on injuries and just production, but you also had Dampier who was just clearly the best athlete on the field. And so you put him in a lot of different situations that maybe you wouldn't have put him in the past, right? Where he's still going to run the ball and he's still going to, you're going to lean into his dynamic ability, but you're relying on him to kind of be your offense. And it worked. But in the same vein, I think you're going to see a little bit of a shift with Utah this year, where by and large, there's a lot more talent around Dampier, where he's still clearly the best player on the field. But I think that level has completely changed in terms of there's guys that are just as talented in their respective roles, right? And so you're going to have less of a reliance on Dampier just making plays. Now, they're going to utilize him, right? Like you have to. He's a guy where if you're not relying on him, you're wasting his talent. And so if you can get that ability to be able to mix those two together, I think this is where things are going to change. And that's where you're learning about what he's talking about with the changing playmaking ability, right? Utah wants to establish the run. They understand that. They've got Dampier, you've got Wayshawn Parker, you've got all these hosts of other players that can run the ball, whether that be Nate Johnson or any of these other guys that I've talked about. That's where they're, going into the season, I think you're going to see, okay, running the ball is going to be one of our most effective things. Clearly, they have to pass the ball too. But where does that come from, right? Who are the guys that you can rely on, and where can you mold that? Is it still going to be what Kyle wants and get it closer to a 50-50 game? You can still establish the run and still, get it closer to 50-50, or is it going to be a 70-30 one way or the other? That's where these next few weeks are going to determine what it is. And some of that's not even going to be determined until you get on the field, right? Where you can think that your receiving game is going to be effective and you drop passes a bunch, right? Or you think your run game is going to be effective and they just get stifled. I would be a little bit more surprised by that based on this offensive line, but it happens, right? There could be a lot of changes that go on, and I think he's approaching it the right mindset of adapting, right? It's not we're going into this season with the playbook, and here's what it's going to be. And every offensive coordinator has to have some adaptations to their playbook, but I think you've got a guy that in theory can adapt a little bit quicker than others because his playbook is a little bit more open in terms of the RPO, the spread type systems where he can attack wherever it needs to be. If Utah can run an effective, I don't want to call it an air raid game, but if you can get more, chunk yardage through the passing game and your receivers are always open, why wouldn't you attack that, right? Devin Dampier could be the greatest runner in the world, but if you're getting a guy that's getting open downfield and getting 30 yards every time, why wouldn't you attack that? And so I think that's where he's approaching it, right? He's got his philosophy where it's RPO-based. It's going to be up-tempo. Kyle Whittingham says it's not going to be ridiculously fast, but it's going to be one that they're going to push, right? And I think with their offensive line, if they can make that effective and they can actually get the yardage that they need to, you're absolutely hurting that defense because now you're pushing the tempo. You're forcing them to not be able to have substitutions. You're forcing them to just have to think so quick. And with Dampier back there, who presents so many different options, it gets that defense just completely frazzled. And so if they can get this to work and they can find and identify that and be effective in it, it's going to be such a different game. They're going to have the no huddle. They're going to have the up tempo, as I mentioned. And part of that can be disastrous too, right? Like you can go into a no huddle up tempo offense, but if your team is getting only 1 to 2 yards every single down, you're punting a lot quicker. And so I think there's going to be a balance there with how fast Utah runs, but I think it's there's still that philosophy that Kyle Whittingham loves to milk the clock, right? You want to be able to take more of the time. But I think some of that is going to change this year, at least in theory, because you have an offense that can move the ball quicker. If Utah's offense scores in 2 minutes, I don't think Kyle Whittingham cares as long as they score, right? I think you saw that last year where the offense was on the field for 2 minutes, but at the same time, it was only moving 7 yards. And so if they can go 2 minutes and get, 70 yards, 80 yards, whatever it may be, and get touchdowns, he'll trade that any day of the week. And, he'll give up his, wanting to milk the clock type situation if it means getting points on the other end. Because as we've learned, you can have a great defense. And not to say that Utah's defense last year was like next level, but you've got to be able to have a great defense, and they've got that. And so if they can pair that with an offense that clicks at a high level, I don't think the time of clock matters to him. It's been kind of that philosophy that it's always he milks the clock, but that's sometimes because he hasn't had the best offense. He's had good quarterbacks, but it hasn't been this great complement of players. So, when Cam was operating at his highest level, they'd score in 2 minutes easily all the time. You even got to the point where Kyle Whittingham was taking the ball at the first part of the game to be able to get those points on the board. You were not deferring to the second half. You can see him shift if he trusts his offense. And so I think, all these things that everybody holds true that Kyle Whittingham is, and it's like milks the clock, he likes to only run the ball. Yeah, because he wants to be able to limit turnovers. But if you've got a team that is effectively moving the ball and scoring points, he doesn't care how fast it goes, right? Points is always going to matter at the end. And then you rely on your defense, and then they have to do their job. And if they're not doing their job, okay, that means the offense has to do even better. But that's kind of where this is going to go. So I don't think there's going to be this huge change in terms of Kyle Whittingham's philosophy. I think it's more of a change in terms of him trusting the offense. And if he trusts the offense, Jason Beck has free reign. And I don't think Jason is sitting there second-guessing himself based on what Kyle says, but I think there's some of that where if things start to fall apart, if Dampier starts to throw a lot of interceptions, or they fumble the ball a lot, or they do different things like that, then you start reverting back to the things that they know that they can trust. You know that you can generally just ground it out, milk the clock, and then let the defense do the rest. But I think you're going to see a different mentality going into this season. So there's that. Let's continue on with this real quick. I don't want to keep going on. This is, it's a lot. But let's talk a little bit about Devin Dampier. So this is his conversations on kind of the progression that Dampier needs to make as a leader. It's clear, talking to him and coaches and players, that Dampier is the leader. Everybody respects him. They get that smile on their face when talking about Dampier, but it's got to shift right now, right? Like, in the offseason, it was easy to be buddy-buddy with these guys and to just have fun and be loose that way. But now for this next month and moving forward for the rest of the year, you've got to be the guy that is checking everything. And so here's what Beck said about kind of the shifting of kind of what his leadership style needs to be.
The last 6 months, Devin's really taken some time to establish his foothold and leadership. I guess heading into fall camp as the offensive coordinator, just what are you looking for him to continue to make steps in establishing himself in the offense and so forth?
Yeah, just continuing to lead, both first by example, through his play, being that real consistent playmaker, doing the right things, and then being a good teammate, which means if you see something, you're not their friend, you're their teammate, whether that's positively reinforcing what they're doing or whether that's asking them to live up to a different standard. And so Dev shows up every day and works hard, and he leads by example. And so just continue to do that, and bring everybody else along and develop the chemistry with all those, skill guys.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to take a lot for Dampier to be that, right? But there comes a point where you have to hold guys accountable. And it's great to be able to have friends and be able to say, hey, we were great friends in the offseason and everything was going great, but you now have to hold them accountable. If things aren't working, he has to be the guy more than anybody else, more than the coaches who hold them accountable. If an offensive lineman is slipping and they're not doing what they need to, he has to be the one to set them straight. That's the nature of just like parenting, right? If I tell my kids one thing, they don't listen. But if somebody else, their peers, their brothers or sisters, whatever, tells them, hey, like maybe we should do this, it comes from a different level, right? It's more of an equal level and it helps. And so if Dampier is out there, hey, dude, you gotta clean this up, it's far different than a coach screaming at a guy, hey, you got to clean that up. Guys will react differently to that. But I think when you have a guy that you know and trust that has your back and he's saying, hey, we got to step this up, it kind of just recharges something in you. And so I think that's where, you've got to see Dampier move forward with this year. And I think by all accounts, that's who he is. And so I don't think it's a hard shift by any means, but you can't just sit there and play, best friend at this point. You've got to be able to have that confidence, that rapport that you built up in the offseason and use that to be able to effectively attack kind of the mistakes or the things that need to be done. So there's that. And then the progression that Dampier needs to make this year.
Last season, Devin ran a lot and also passed a lot. Is there a development that you're looking for, maybe to have him be more pass first or maybe more run first? I mean, walk me through your thinking on that.
He'll, just him individually, he'll continue to progress and develop and is really capable. So this is not a thing where we were running him more because he was not capable as a passer. It was just, and he'll continue to develop that way. It was really just the pieces around him and what we could do led to him being more involved in the run game. Certain times in the season, we had some critical injuries. And so he became, if it's 4th and 2, who do you trust most to get this thing? And with a couple, there was a spot where in the car he was out with a high ankle sprain. In a couple of those games, no, you absolutely knew Devin would get you the first, so you called his number a little more. So it's just kind of dictated by, the matchup, how, all those things.
So it's like I said before, this is a guy that was relied on to be the best player. And, it's learning, where he can impact the game the most. If they need to get him in 3rd and 1, and he's the guy that they trust the most, they're going to utilize him, right? But it's learning to progress as a player. So there's clear evidence to show that he was a talented quarterback at New Mexico, but it's now taking that progression. And if you remember, if you listen to the Big 12 Media Days episode, talking to Dampier, he recognizes that. He recognizes that he has to take it to that next level. He understands that he's now playing at a power forward level, right? That the competition is going to be much more challenging. But at the same vein, he's been able to see the progression in his own game from playing against Utah's defense. And so, we'll see what his progression is, but that's still TBD, right? Like, I think we'll see what's there. But I think there's a lot of people that look at his turnover to interception ratio and just say, oh, well, he's not that good of a quarterback. And, it may be a similar thing at Utah. We'll see. But I think they feel fully confident in who he is, and I think he'll be put in better situations than he was in New Mexico with the talent that he has. Maybe, right? We'll see. But I think that's what's there. As a side tangent to that, just kind of talking about a couple players before I move over to the defense. Utah needs 100% their receivers to step up. I've talked about that it's not like the most vital thing, but you need receivers to be able to impact this game. You can't just let teams stack the box like they had last year and just absolutely bull rush Dampier every single down. You've got to relax that, and Utah has much more plays designed in its offense to be able to help that, whether that be the screens or these short dump-off passes that are going to help that a little bit. But you need that quote-unquote wide receiver one to be able to step up. And right now, you look at Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons, 2 guys that transferred in after the spring. We haven't gotten a good looks at them in terms of actually watching them on the field. These are the guys that you have to have step up. And by all accounts, they look the part. They've approached the offseason the right way and coming into fall camp. And from what I've heard, these guys are absolutely living up to that billing. Health and ability to play in the games is going to play into that. But these two guys, if they can take hold, absolutely changes the dynamic of this offense. They're big, they're physical. These are guys that are your prototypical wide receiver one. And if you can get that, I think Utah's in a great spot. If you're on Twitter, Utah posted a video of Isaac Wilson throwing a dart to Larry Simmons for a toe-tapping grab, and it's remarkable, right? Like, those are the types of plays, one, that Isaac Wilson is known for getting him into tight windows and placing it in the right spot, but also you see the athleticism of Larry Simmons to be able to go and grab the ball in a way that is challenging, but still keep your foot in bounds and get that touchdown, right? Like, it was exactly the way that you need to draw it up. And there's not much that DB can do if the ball is placed there. These are some great things, and it's just a snippet of what's there. But I think if Utah can get that kind of play, and it doesn't have to be these sideline, toe-tapping type touchdowns or whatever that may be every single time. But if you can get those guys impacting it at a high level, Utah's in a completely different spot with its offense. So far, so good. We'll see what happens when the pads come on this week, when we talk to the coaches and everything. But as it sounds, the offense has had a great week, and, it's trending in the right direction. So let's shift over to the defense. The defense every single year doesn't have as many questions, but that's not to say that there aren't things that this team is worrying about, right? And worry may be a phrase that they wouldn't say. I think it's more just looking at kind of experience. And so one of those biggest areas is at the defensive line. We've talked about this. There's just not a lot of returning talent in terms of production that is coming there. Now, with that said, there are a lot of guys that have production and are effective, but I think it's just a difference in trying to make sure that they are consistent, similar to what the offensive side was, right? They need consistent guys that are going to prove it each and every week. Morgan Scalley talked about he's not worried about their physicality. They've come in, their weight is there. They don't feel like they've got a lot of these undersized guys that just don't have the girth, for better sake of word, to be able to do what they need to. They just need to make sure that they're consistent. And some of these guys are younger, and they're going to take their lumps, right? Like, this isn't going to be an easy situation at all times, but I think if they can get this done in fall camp, that helps. That UCLA game is going to be a great test for the defensive line in particular on where they're at. If it's a complete mess, Morgan Scalley knows exactly what he needs to do to be able to get there. He may not have anything to change, right? Like years ago, for example, their secondary completely was turned over, right? They had so many young guys. You had so many new faces that just didn't have that experience, and they took their lumps. But that helped them tremendously in the years to follow to be able to build that. And I don't think the defensive line will necessarily have that kind of a drop-off, but I think you're just looking for proven guys, trying to get guys that are developing that depth and being able to move forward. At the end of the day, they have guys that they feel confident in. You've got Dallas Vakalaki, who is potentially the star of that defensive line in terms of the defensive tackles. He's a guy that came on strong at the end of the year, coming off of his mission. It takes some time, and you really saw it kind of click at the end of the year. So they have a lot of faith in kind of what he can do. You've got Aliki Vamahi, who has been in the system forever. He understands what it takes to be able to play at Utah. This is a guy that, understands it at a high level. Health has limited him a bit. And so if you can get just those two guys alone, you've got great top-tier talent, top-end talent. Behind them, it's the other guys that you need to develop the depth. Now with that, you've got Jonah Leia, who he also has a lot of talent and experience. So you've got guys there. You've got a guy like Carson Kafusi who can factor into that, who's a younger guy, but he's been making tremendous strides. There's a lot of optimism about that. So as much as there's questions about kind of what this defensive line can be, I don't think that there's this overarching worry that Utah is going to be in trouble. But we'll see, right? And I think we'll see how that plays, especially when Utah gets on the field. So let's jump into some Morgan Scalley audio. Let's talk about his approach to fall camp this year and the physicality and kind of how they want to approach this so that they have enough to be able to understand what they've got, but also not trying to kill these guys and get them injured before the season starts.
When you look at fall camp, how do you want to approach it in terms of trying to like get guys aggressive, kind of get them ready, but also still kind of save some for the season?
Yeah, it's a physical sport. You gotta be able to practice tackling. I think a few years ago when we played Florida, first time we played Florida at their place, we tried to dial it down physically, and we missed a ton of tackles in that game, and it exposed us a little bit. So yes, we want to get to the first game healthy, and we're spacing out the practices and the periods in a way that we feel like we're being smart with their health. But at the same time, as a physical sport, you got to practice physicality, you got to be able to tackle and do the things that football players do.
And I think they're approaching that the right way in terms of taking the right days off, right? Not just going at it every single day at the same level. It's trying to approach it in a way that is beneficial to help your team understand how physical they have to play. And nobody's going to question the physicality of Utah's practices. But I think it's more just a balancing act of kind of how quickly you return guys to that physical nature, right? Football is physical, as he says, in nature, but you have guys that, you've got to balance that with trying to rest up and heal, right? There's a reason why you don't have games every single week or every single day or every few days, because it just is a physical nature and you need guys to heal. So there's some sports science behind that, some health science behind it to be able to help, but you've got to be able to kind of at the same time figure out how fast you can be in terms of getting these guys back, how physical you can be so that they're not missing time, and just understanding kind of where that they need to be. So moving on to the next point, talking about kind of how Devin Dampier can help this defense. I think obviously you have a dual threat quarterback who gives any team fits, right? So it's not like the defense is going to be looking at this and saying, hey, we've got all, the game plan figured out. Mobile quarterbacks are just tough. And so having one of your own who can be a true dual threat quarterback can help. And now it's just a question of kind of what he can do to help the defense in this time.
You've seen a lot of offensive looks in your tenure, but what does it mean to have a guy like Devin Dampier who can kind of make things just different to kind of help your defense?
Athletic quarterbacks just cause issues, particularly when you're going to use them in a dedicated quarterback run game. It's one thing for him to just pull it on his own, escape the pocket, things break down, and he's able to make plays just with his legs on his own. But when there's a dedicated run package, or that you as a defensive coordinator really have to focus on, okay, how are we going to add a guy in the box? How are we going to take care of the quarterback in the run game? It really forces you to practice that. So he provides both. He can, if you're going to 4-man rush the kid, he does a great job of understanding when things break down, when to take off, but they also have a very good dedicated QB run game.
And look, like Utah's experienced this, right? Like it's not like they haven't gone up against dual threat QBs, but at the same time, when you have a guy that is doing it to you every single week, it gives you just more vision of kind of what it is. Like Utah's had dual threat quarterbacks at times, but not to the level that Dampier is, right? And so when you have a guy to that true level, it helps you understand, okay, I saw this play and we know that we can match him up or do whatever. But if just his God-given talents changes that, now you understand, okay, we were completely unprepared for that situation. That helps you, right? It's just more becoming familiar with what that presents, right? So you understand it at a level that makes more sense. It's not like this is changing everything for the defense, right? Like it's not like all of a sudden Devin Dampier comes and the defense is like, oh, we didn't know how to do this before. Now we're so grateful to have you. I think there's some aspects of that, but I think it's more just understanding and recognizing it at a better consistency, right? And understanding that like you have to be able to have this, that it's not a surprise when you go into games if you go up against a mobile quarterback. So I think it helps. It's not, once again, it's not earth-shattering or groundbreaking about how these teams approach it, but it definitely is one of those things that can help this team give them fits to understand, okay, hey, we thought we were prepared here, but maybe our blitz package wasn't great. We lost contain. In years past, it's been the biggest frustration with mobile quarterbacks is Utah would get to the backfield. They seemingly had everything in place, and then this mobile quarterback just escapes the pocket, which that's, it's tough to contain that because these guys are their own talent. But it's understanding, okay, how do we over pursue? How do we get this in a way that kind of contains it a little bit more? So it's stuff like that helps understanding kind of where the team can be in terms of competing against mobile quarterbacks that are slippery, that can get out of the pocket. Now, let's shift to kind of the defensive philosophy that Morgan Scalley has. And I wrote an article about this last week about Sack Lake City, right? Like a lot of people want to have that moniker mean something for this team. And for a long time it has, and it's not that it's going to change per se, but I think Scalley in particular is looking for a wholesale look at the defense, right? If your whole focus is just to sack the quarterback, you're going to miss on a whole bunch of other things, right? And if you're only obtaining a sack as kind of the end goal, you're going to miss out on opportunities to be able to be effective in other ways and putting pressure. And so I think this is kind of his approach. Well, this is his approach and kind of how he focuses on it. So here's what Morgan said about kind of the Sack Lake City stuff while answering a question that kind of fully wasn't about that.
Your defensive end room looks noticeably different, obviously in terms of the faces, but also just leaner builds, more athleticism. Has that been a point of emphasis this offseason, increasing the athleticism?
Not necessarily. I would say getting stronger, definitely. You're always looking for speed off the edge. This is, again, a point I've talked about before. I'm much more focused on a productive, efficient pass rush than sacks. If I'm hitting a quarterback, if I'm being disruptive, then you're forcing him to get rid of the ball quicker than he wants to. So I felt like we did a pretty good job of that last year. Obviously, the sack count wasn't what it was in previous seasons, but I felt like we were effective at getting to the quarterback. I like the depth that we have there. I think that we've gotten better. Coach Powell's done a great job of developing that group, and it's going to be a competitive fall camp for those guys.
And then let's go into him talking about havoc plays, because these all kind of pair together.
At the beginning of spring, you talked about having an emphasis on more havoc plays this season. How do you feel that went in the spring, and then how does that work going to continue going on into the fall?
I felt like havoc plays were a strong emphasis in spring. I felt like we did a really good job of it. The takeaways were really good. That's got to continue in fall camp. The studies have shown us that your takeaways come from. Your number one takeaway in the Big 12 last year was an interception in zone coverage. It's zone eyes. It's quarterbacks forcing things into windows. The second was interceptions in man coverage, which man coverage, usually that's more of an incompletion coverage. Your completion percentage goes down. And so the majority of interceptions you see there are, tipped passes, free safety coming over the top. And then, so the next thing that you're looking at is forced fumbles from the second guy in, not the first guy in, second guy in. So there are certain takeaways, certain aspects of takeaways that you can practice. Zone drops, catching a football, including footballs in your drill work. And then a focus on second guy in, how to strip the ball, how to take care of the ball, how to go down, how to recover a ball in traffic versus how to recover a ball in space, right? And so those are the things that we have to do a really good job of. The things that you can practice in terms of takeaways, you better be practicing. And I feel like we're doing a good job of that.
All right, that's a lot of information that Scalley gave, but it shows kind of the approach that they're having in terms of kind of the holistic view of what they want to do with this team, right? It's not just focusing on one thing. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and as you heard, there's a lot of research that they've looked into and kind of what is done in the Big 12. And so I think they're focusing on all these things in a way that is more, as I said, holistic, where it's not just, okay, we only have to get sacks. And that's never been like the thing where it's just like, well, Morgan Scalley's only focused on sacks. That's never been it, right? He's always been trying to focus on the full game instead of just like one individual play. They all matter. They all stack up. Those are important. But it's really just focusing on what this team can be as a whole. And their biggest point is creating havoc plays, getting turnovers, and flipping the field, right? And so if it means just getting a QB hurry, or if it means just getting a guy that is putting pressure on a quarterback, those are effective, right? You don't have to just have the sack to be able to make it effective. Obviously, that is the dream scenario, right? Whether it's a sack fumble or just a sack in general or any of those situations, those are the best. But at the end of the day, it's not a matter of just looking at a stat line that says this team had X amount of sacks. It's looking at it from a holistic standpoint and say, did we do our job to put pressure on the offensive line? Do we put pressure on the quarterback? Did we make them have to think quicker than what normally they needed to do, right? There's a lot of talented quarterbacks in the Big 12 who are experienced with teams that are rushing at a high level, that, you know, they're getting the ball out fast. Can you do this at a level that gets them off that even where they can kind of get frustrated? That's kind of where it needs to be, and I think that's what Scalley's approaching. It's trying to find the right times to do the right things, right? You're getting that first guy in who's going to attack the quarterback, but then you have the second guy who isn't maybe just looking at the sack, he's looking to strip the ball. It's finding your opportunities at the right time to be able to understand the play and make the play. Now, granted, sack sometimes is just the best opportunity, but there are situations where Utah can be a little bit more effective. So that's going to be it today. That's a lot. I thank you for listening and staying along this far. Hopefully we'll get a lot more insight this week. We get media sessions on Wednesday where we get to talk to Whittingham and the offense. And then on Thursday, we get to talk to the defense. And so I'll have that for you next week. Next week, we shift earlier in the week, so I'll probably push my podcast back a couple days just so that we can have the most fresh info, we'll say, each week. So that's what we'll do. We'll continue to go with this, but Utah's getting close, and things are looking good right now, but it's still early, and, at the end of the day, football's coming back. So appreciate it. We'll talk to you next week, and hope you have a great week.